This is a pretty beautiful space. It's majestic, it's awe-inspiring, it's almost cavernous, and we're still paying it off. Now imagine how you would feel if somebody walked into this beautiful worship space, in so many ways almost brand new, that we are still paying the mortgage for, and somebody came in and said, one day it's all going to get knocked down. How would you feel? Hold on to that feeling, because that's the conversation that kicks things off in Mark chapter 13, in this session of Meeting Jesus. So when we last left the story of Jesus and the disciples, we finished up Mark chapter 12, and Jesus had been in the temple dealing with a handful of controversies and questions, some sincere, like what's the greatest commandment, to some that felt like they were gotcha questions, like how can the resurrection be true if people have been married to multiple spouses in their lifetimes, who are they married to, or is it lawful to pay taxes? And a whole variety of people had all sort of converged on the temple where Jesus was, and Jesus had come out pretty clearly saying, this building, this box where we say we come and worship God isn't really God. We've built this whole other way of saying we can connect to God when God has really always been interested in loving God, loving neighbor, and not in building up this whole other institutional system that ends up preying on the poor and ends up taking advantage of people. That's where things had left last time. So Jesus is walking out of the temple with his disciples around him, and they're still just in awe of the space, of the building that human beings have built as a place to worship God. And we've said all along throughout Mark's gospel that Jesus seems at best ambivalent about whether having a temple is a good idea, right? That even when our best intentions is to create a space where we can encounter the living God, where we can offer sacrifice and worship God, at its worst, it always ends up becoming a box we put God in. And a gilded cage is still a cage. So even if you think you've made a really lovely spot that you contain your God in, you're still confusing God for an idol if you can trap that God in a box or confine God to a system or a set of rituals or sacrifices. And Jesus says that was never God's intent. So Jesus has been kind of standoffish, aloof about the whole business of having a temple all throughout the Gospels. And now as they're leaving, the disciples are like, oh, what a beautiful building, what beautiful, amazing big stones. And Jesus' response back is, do you see all these stones? There's coming a day when they'll all be knocked down, when there won't be one stone left on top of another. Now, it's worth remembering in context that the temple structure that they're walking through, the second temple, the one that had been sort of undergone a great renovation and expansion during the time of Herod the Great, was still sort of being finished. That it was just like brand new right on the time of having been constructed, been completed, and it was this huge expansion over the modest second temple that had been built after the exile. And of course, it was sort of a remembrance of the first temple that traced all the way back to the days of King Solomon. So there had been a temple on this spot for an awful long time, and for Jesus to almost casually, glibly just to say, there's coming a day when it's all going to get knocked down, it conjured up the absolute worst feelings. What do you mean? This glorious space we built to honor and worship God, and that we've just now completed so recently in our lifetimes, that was under construction for decades, that took a long time to get rebuilt after the Babylonians had knocked it down, it shook hearers to the core to suggest that this building wouldn't be around forever. And it brought back the memories of the last time the temple had been destroyed, when an invading army, the Babylonians, came, destroyed the city of Jerusalem and burned everything to the ground and ransacked the temple. And Jesus is basically threatening, not that he's going to knock it down, but to say the trajectory that everybody's on right now, you're setting things up for this to happen all over again, not with the Babylonians, but with the Romans. A side note, that's exactly what happened in the year AD 70. So 40 years after the time of Jesus, the Romans did come and not only destroyed the city of Jerusalem again when there was a revolt against them, but also destroyed the temple, so that it is still rubble there, and all that remains on that old Temple Mount of the second temple from Jesus' day are these foundation stones that are now called the Wailing Wall. That's where the temple used to be. Jesus is warning, saying, you guys are headed down the same path that it took you, that you got your temple destroyed before back 586 BC. You're headed down that same path again. And if you're pinning all your hopes on, we've got a glorious building to worship God, and get ready to be disappointed. There will come a day when even this structure that you think will last forever, even this building that you think is permanent and as eternal as creation itself, will be shaken. Well, of course, this makes Jesus' listeners awfully uncomfortable. I mean, even suggesting that this temple could get knocked down sounds like a threat to them. In a way, if you can remember that gut reaction you had when you saw the towers come down on September 11th, 2001, right? These are symbols of our way of life, symbols of commerce. That's exactly why the Twin Towers were some of those that were chosen by the terrorists to knock down and to bring down with those planes. If you can remember how vulnerable and scared you felt that something you thought would last forever, something that human ingenuity had built that reached to the sky, could be knocked down so easily with just a single act of violence like that. And you can understand why Jesus' disciples are really, really unnerved by what he says. Jesus isn't threatening to be the one to knock down the temple, but Jesus is saying, the stuff that you guys have put your hopes on and assumed would last forever, assumed was permanent and glorious and that God was backing, it's not going to last forever. God isn't stuck here in the temple. God doesn't need for there to be a temple. So the disciples start asking, well, when's this going to happen? How will we know to get ready for this? This sounds like a pretty big deal. Shouldn't we get ready for it? And Jesus gives answers that are intentionally ambiguous, I think. The kinds of answers Jesus gives, he says, many will come in my name and say, I'm he. And when you hear wars and rumors of wars, don't be alarmed. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs. In other words, Jesus doesn't give his disciples concrete details that are specific to predict when this event of the temple being destroyed would happen. Jesus is beginning to say more like, be prepared. All these kind of terrible things that are like world-shaking events, that'll be a part of this as well. And Jesus doesn't give his disciples like secret details for how to predict when the temple will be destroyed, or later as the conversation morphs toward when he comes in glory. He instead is beginning to train his disciples to think in terms of how would you live your life always ready for the things that everybody else thinks are permanent to be shaken. And what would ground you if you didn't have your trust in the physical structures being the same always? Let's be honest, a church building like this, which is beautiful, which is still in the process of being paid off, it is still almost brand new, there will come a day when this will be an old building, right? Imagine a century from now. What will this space look like? What kind of renovation projects will have had to happen? Will there be yet another building project and yet other worship spaces? Churches come and go. Churches close even. If our hope is pinned to, it's got to be this space just like this. It's got to be this building just like this. We have unsubtly confused Jesus for an idol of our own construction. It's easy for us to do. So rather than just blaming people 2,000 years ago for getting unnecessarily obsessed with their temple building, maybe we can feel a certain kinship. Yeah, we'd feel really threatened if somebody said our worship space wasn't going to last forever. But what if somebody stopped and said, you know that the worship space isn't really God, right? You know that this is a building, and it is not something God needs to be housed in. It's something we find useful in order to turn our attention and focus on God. But God is not confined to this space, even a nice space. Jesus, in the beginning of the 13th chapter of Mark's gospel, is trying to get his disciples to hear that even the buildings and the structures and the institutions that they have counted on to be reliable and to be always there all their lives long, they won't always last. And if your hope is actually pinned on the building, if your faith is actually in the structure or the temple or the sacrifices, then that sounds like a vital existential threat. But if your hope is on the living God, who is always beyond the bounds of our building, who doesn't stay inside the walls of a temple or a sanctuary or a chancel or an altar, then the coming and going of buildings, even the coming and going of other things we thought were permanent, they don't have to make us afraid. Knowing that those things won't last allows us to redirect our trust and our energy on who and what will last. So later on in this chapter, when Jesus goes on to describe things being shaken in the heavens, like the sun and the moon failing and the stars falling, this is less a prediction about literally the sun falling down to the earth or the moon crashing onto the ground or the stars, which are light years away, somehow all coming to earth, but more to imagine the things you think of as the most permanent, the most reliable, the most faithful, the most unchanging. Those things can get shaken too. And yeah, when the temple eventually got destroyed, it felt like their whole world came down. It felt like everything got shaken to the core. Jesus speaks about placing our trust in someone that is even more reliable than the solidness of a building, even more reliable than the sun in the sky or the moon and the stars at night. And that because our trust ultimately is in God, the God we've come to know in Jesus, then it will be okay if other things get shaken, if they come and go, if buildings age and have to be repaired or replaced or renovated. We can be okay with that because our trust ultimately has to be in Jesus and the God whom we come to meet in Jesus, not in even the nicest buildings we build to meet God in. Turns out there's maybe an awful lot of similarities between what was going on in the 13th chapter of Mark, as scary and ominous as it might seem, and our own worship life, our own life as church in the 21st century. We're going to keep plowing through Mark chapter 13 for a couple of sessions because there's a lot of material and it can seem really intimidating. But join us for those conversations, whether you catch up with these video summaries or you're with us around the table in Bible study at Thursdays at 1 o'clock here at Community of Christ, as together we keep meeting Jesus. See you then.